Last day we talked about the male and female reproductive anatomy, and we alluded a little bit to the female anatomy and what happened if that egg was fertilized, and we alluded a little bit to what happened if that egg wasn't. So we're going to get into a little bit more detail on the menstrual cycle today, and then we'll get into what happens if that egg is fertilized, and we'll go from there. So you have this picture on the top of page 32 in your books. So if we actually have a look at the picture, it's illustrating the menstrual cycle. It shows you the ovaries and what's happening with the egg. It shows you how the uterine lining thickens, and it gives you a time. So let's just, before we get into kind of the notes and breaking it down into steps, let's just have a look at what's happening in this picture. So on average, females have a 28-day cycle. But it's very common for some females to have a cycle that's as short as 21 days and others to have a cycle that's as long as 34 days. But this is the average length. So the ovum develops kind of on the first day. So here in the ovaries, you see that ovum developing. So that's that egg maturing. Okay? But at day 1, menstruation is also happening. Okay? So if we look here, menstruation typically happens for about 7 days. But while that uterine lining is being shed, that egg is getting ready to be released. So menstruation's happening. Okay, the uterine lining, once that's done, starts to thicken again. So here, it's not very thick, but it's going to start to thicken. And that egg, that ovum, is pretty close to the edge of the uterus. It's about to be released. Okay? On about day 14 or 15, so 2 weeks after the first day of your menstrual cycle, which would be here, or the first day, that you start to menstruate, about 2 weeks later, so it will kind of about, if you menstruate for a full 7 days, about 7 days after, ovulation happens. So that ovum is released. And this picture really clearly shows that that fallopian tube is not attached to the ovary, right? So the egg is released, and those finger-like fimbria, again, are going to tease that egg into the fallopian tube. So then the egg travels down the fallopian tube, and that uterine lining, again, we see it here as well as here, begins to thicken. If that egg is not fertilized, the lining gets shed. That's usually what doctors would consider the first day of the menstrual cycle is the first day of menstruation. And they consider it because that's the one day that we kind of know. Does that make sense? So that's the first day of the menstrual cycle is the shed, and the ovum, as that lining is being shed from the previous menstrual cycle, your ovary is already starting to develop. It gets the hormones to develop a new egg. Okay, and again, if menstruation happens for about 7 days, then we start the process all over again with the uterine lining thickening. Ovulation happens again about 2 weeks after the first day of your menstrual cycle, or a female's menstrual cycle. So, like I said, that's day 1 of the menstrual cycle because that's the only day that's usually pretty definitive. Does that mean that, you're safe before the egg is released? So if you have unprotected sex on day 10, that you're safe? No, right? And so that, just because this is roughly 2 weeks, doesn't mean that for some reason it doesn't happen a day or two on either side. So keep that in mind. So the process of menstruation kind of goes like this, and we can break it down into steps. So menstruation is defined as the shedding of the uterine lining or the endometrium when fertilization does not occur. So when the egg is not fertilized by a sperm, then menstruation occurs. So menstruation starts back in that master gland in your brain called the pituitary gland. Again, that pituitary gland releases follicle-stimulating hormone into the bloodstream. That stimulates those follicles that carry those eggs that are suspended in meiosis in the ovaries to develop. Okay? They develop into fluid-filled cavities that protect and nourish the egg while it finishes maturing. So step 2, those follicles secrete the hormone estrogen. So once the follicles get the right hormonal signals, the right chemical signals, they start to make estrogen. Estrogen is then released into the bloodstream. It stimulates the thickening of the uterine lining, so that endometrium. And that estrogen travels back up to the brain and tells the pituitary gland to start making another hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH. So the third step would be ovulation. That luteinizing hormone travels from the brain back down to the ovaries, and it stimulates ovulation. So ovulation is the process of releasing that egg from the follicle into the fallopian tube. That follicle then develops into the corpus luteum, and like I said last day, the best way I can kind of describe that is it's like a scab. And that scab in step 4 starts to make another hormone called progesterone. Okay, so progesterone is almost more like the pregnancy hormone. Does that make sense? So progesterone further thickens that uterine lining. And it sends messages back up to the brain to tell the pituitary gland to stop releasing follicle-stimulating hormone and that luteinizing hormone. We don't want any more eggs to be released just in case that one egg that we just released gets fertilized. So the progesterone travels back up to the brain, tells that pituitary gland to stop making these follicle-stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormone, and that prevents more eggs from being released if the egg is fertilized in the fallopian tube. Then, step 5, if fertilization occurs, if that egg is fertilized by a sperm from a male, then it will travel down the fallopian tube and implant in the uterine lining, or that endometrium, and development begins. If fertilization does not occur, then the endometrium is shed, and that's called menstruation. Okay? So just for interest's sake, if a female is taking the birth control pills basically mimic those levels of progesterone in a female's body and tell the brain to stop making the follicle-stimulating hormone. So eggs are never matured and never released. And that's basically how a birth control pill works in the nutshell. But if the egg is fertilized, then a human kind of develops. So we're going to just take a second before we go into human reproduction to have a look at human development. So if an egg and a sperm unite, okay, that's called fertilization, this is going to happen in the female's fallopian tube. So the egg, remember by meiosis, we reduce the number of chromosomes by half, so it's now haploid, it has one set. The sperm went through meiosis as well. It reduced the number of chromosomes by half. So the egg has 23 chromosomes in a human. The sperm has 23 chromosomes in a human. So when they unite, this zygote, this fertilized egg, has a full set of 46. 23 came from the female, the egg. 23 came from the male or the sperm. That zygote, it's only called a zygote when it's one cell. So that zygote begins to divide with mitosis. And it'll actually start dividing as it's traveling down the fallopian tube. This is called cleavage, okay? And then it forms a ball of cells called a blastocyst. So you can see the word blastocyst in your notes. What does that mean? That means a ball of cells. Once that blastocyst, that ball of cells, implants in the endometrium, in that uterine lining, that's now thick and has a rich blood supply, it's now called an embryo. And it stays in embryo till between kind of 2 and 3 months, and then it's called a fetus, it. Then the offspring, I guess is a better word than it, is called a fetus. So we've been practicing some terms, we've been using some of these, but the terms you need to know are ovulation. That's when the egg is released from the ovary. Fertilization is when the egg and the sperm unite, and again, it happens in the fallopian tube of the female. The zygote is basically that fertilized egg when it's one cell. So the diploid gamete, so 2 copies of the chromosomes now, 46 chromosomes in humans, that's produced when the egg and the sperm combine. And again, it's just a zygote when it's one cell. Okay? Implantation is when that ball of cells that's been dividing as it travels down the fallopian tube implants in that uterine lining. An embryo is the name kind of once it implants. Fetus is the name after about 2 months. And gestation is the time from fertilization to birth. In human, it's approximately 9 months. More commonly, it's 40 weeks, but doctors count this from the first day of the last menstrual cycle. So that's the only thing we know for sure, right? We don't know exactly when a female ovulated. So doctors are going to say, what was the first day of your last menstrual cycle? And they're actually going to count 40 weeks from that first day. So are the first couple of weeks, are you pregnant? No, a female is not pregnant those first couple of weeks, but that's what we count. So 40 weeks from that first day of the last menstrual cycle. So if a male ejaculates during sexual intercourse or has an emission, about 3 to 4 milliliters of semen is transferred from the penis into the vagina. Remember that semen is a combination of sperm and seminal fluid. Okay? So this is between 150 to 450 million sperm. And sperm can survive between kind of 25 hours and 72 hours, up to 3 days inside the oviduct or in the fallopian tube. Most of them are going to die along the way, so only a few thousand are going to make it up to the fallopian tubes. If fertilization is to take place, a sperm will meet an egg, usually in the upper part of the fallopian tube or that oviduct. Okay? So again, what we see here in this picture is we see the immature eggs, they're being developed. Here's ovulation happening. The egg is released into the fallopian tube. It travels down. And right here, we see that egg has united with a sperm. That's become a zygote. Then it divides into 2 cells there. There's, they divided and divided as it's moving down the fallopian tubes, and it's a ball of cells. This would be called a blastocyst. This here that's implanted in that uterine lining would be called an embryo. Okay? So what we see in these pictures is that kind of ball of cells in 6 to 7 days, 12 to 13 days. The cells are starting to differentiate and become different parts of the body. 14 or 15 days, 18 or 19 days, 21, 22 days, it looks kind of like a blob. But 26 to 27 days, we can see that there's an eye kind of developing. We can see the vertebrae or that spinal column developing. Okay? So that sperm that make it to the egg or ovum produce an enzyme that basically breaks down the covering of the cells around the ovum or the egg. Once one sperm has penetrated the covering, a chemical reaction happens, and it prevents any more sperm from fertilizing that egg. Because we don't want more than our 46 chromosomes. That's not going to do. So the nuclei of the egg, so that's the brain of the cell where all that DNA is, those chromosomes, fuse together. So that's the point of conception. So that's the point when a zygote is formed. So we have the egg with 23, we have the sperm with 23 chromosomes. Okay? The sperm will penetrate the egg, and then basically the sperm's just depositing the genetic material. All of the other organelles, the mitochondria, the the Golgi apparatus, all the other organelles that you have in your cell come from your mother. So basically the sperm can be small because it's just depositing the genetic information, and everything else comes from the egg. The egg is the only cell of the human body that we can see with the naked eye. That's how big it is. I mean, although it's not very big, but. So that new individual is called a zygote only when it's one cell. Okay? That zygote moves down the oviduct or the fallopian tube towards the uterus, and it gets to the uterus about 5 to 7 days later. As it moves, it's dividing now by mitosis, right? Making identical cells. Okay, that was the point of mitosis. Splits into 2 identical cells. The zygote that has divided is called an embryo. Again, it's a blastocyst and then an embryo, but you just need to know zygote, embryo, fetus for this course. When it reaches the uterus, that embryo consists of about 100 cells. The embryo then implants into the lining of the uterus. Okay? And this we'll talk about with the next page. Okay? You have this here. So this picture kind of goes with the next page of notes. So I'm going to flip my chart and we might come back to there. So the embryo can get all the nutrients, so oxygen and sugar it needs, through the lining of the wall until it kind of reaches a certain size. And then simple diffusion of nutrients and oxygen and waste products isn't enough. The embryo gets too big. So after kind of around 2 to 3 months, a placenta will begin to develop between the embryo and the mother. So it's composed basically of membranes that surround the embryo and the tissue from the wall of the uterus. So blood vessels of the mother and the embryo lie side by side. They don't actually touch, but they're close enough that we can diffuse things in and out. The placenta is connected to the baby through the umbilical cord. Okay, so that's our umbilical cord is where our belly button is, right? That's where the umbilical cord used to go in. So gases like oxygen, we need oxygen to come in. We need to get carbon dioxide away. Nutrients like sugars. When you're building from scratch, you're going to need amino acids to make proteins. You're going to need minerals like calcium to make the bones of the baby. Any hormones and waste will diffuse between those blood vessels lying side by side across the placenta, and that's how the embryo stays alive. And once the placenta is there, it's actually called a fetus. The waste produced by the embryo or the fetus are taken away by the mother, and the nutrients and oxygen the embryo needs are given by the mother. So the mother needs to be careful about what she eats and drinks, because at this point in time, drugs and alcohol, as well as other chemicals, can cross the placenta. So when I say drugs, this could be illicit drugs, but this could also be medicinal drugs, right? You need to be careful that you're not taking, certain kinds of painkillers, even Advil, okay, or aspirin. Okay, so the placenta makes a hormone that acts on that corpus luteum to keep it working and secreting progesterone. So that maintains that really thick lining of the uterus, and that prevents the menstrual cycle from occurring. Menstruation will only start again after the baby's born. Okay? So after kind of that 8 to 10 weeks, between 2 and 3 months there, the embryo is called a fetus. At about 8 weeks, the fetus has a face, eyes, nose, lips, and the heart beats. During the 3rd month, the muscles, nerves, and bones are well developed. So before I go back to this, I'm just going to pop back to this picture here at the bottom of the page. Okay? So here, in the picture right here, we see kind of that placenta, that lining of the membranes. If we kind of zoomed in on that, it's going to look like this. Okay, so here's kind of the blood vessels carrying the fetal blood. Okay, here's kind of the maternal blood here, and they're lying side by side. So things like oxygen and sugar are going to diffuse in, and things like carbon dioxide and waste will diffuse out and be taken away by the mother. Okay? Any questions on that? All right. So let's pop down again to the bottom of this page. Okay? During the 4th month, legs and arms start to move, so you'll start to feel kind of a flutter of the baby moving. So here's kind of the first trimester. Here's what, the mother's stomach would look like, or the uterus would look like. And there's kind of the baby in that first kind of 0 to 12 weeks. 2nd trimester, about 13 to 28 weeks. Okay, you can see that the female's uterus has grown bigger, it's larger, and there's where baby is. And that 3rd trimester, 29 to 40 weeks, the uterus actually extends almost all the way through the abdominal cavity, right? It's stretched right up here, so that's where it's going to start to put pressure on the other organs, making the female have to urinate more frequently. And you'll see that the baby, as they get ready for delivery, should start to turn so that they're head down. Okay? Human gestation, so the time between conception and birth, is approximately 266 days. Typically, the bigger the animal, the longer the gestation period. So, a mouse, about every 3 weeks, 21 days. Okay, that's the gestation period. Dogs every kind of 63 days. We're 266 days. A horse, that's a bigger animal than us, 335 days. A whale, almost a whole year. And an elephant is closer to 2 years. Okay. Any questions? Okay, we're just going to quickly go through the pieces on birth. And then that's it for today. So labor is caused by hormonal signals. And basically, the rhythmic contraction of the expansion of the uterine muscle. So we said the uterus was kind of a pear-shaped muscle. So that muscle starts to contract. Those contractions tell the brain to make a chemical called oxytocin, or a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin acts on the uterus. It tells the uterus to contract longer, stronger, faster, harder. The more contractions, the more oxytocin the brain makes, the more oxytocin, the more contractions, until the baby's born. So these hormonal signals will enlarge the opening to the uterus. So it'll kind of, the cervix will kind of open up, and then the baby is pushed out through the vagina. The placenta and the uterine lining are also expelled. So this is called the afterbirth. The baby usually takes its first breath of air kind of moments after birth. Okay, so again, during birth, again, the baby should be head down. Okay, and then the cervix will kind of efface and open up. That's the dilation part. And then the baby is pushed out. And as the baby comes down, if everything goes right, we want the baby to actually be face down. Okay, and then the head comes out, and then you have to deliver the shoulders and the rest of the baby. And then the afterbirth, that placenta needs to be delivered after that. Okay, so once the baby's delivered, the umbilical cord is cut, and now that baby, at least in the strictest sense, is an independent organism. However, it's going to rely on its parent for many years. So we provide, as humans, provide care for approximately 18 years after our offspring are born. So in order for the mother to help feed the baby, we're mammals, so humans have mammary glands in their breasts, and those will start to make milk. So hormones after birth will enlarge the breast, or during pregnancy will enlarge them and cause the milk to flow after childbirth. The secretion of milk is called lactation, and lactation will continue as long as the baby is breastfed. So human milk is the most nutritious food for the baby. It also contains antibodies that are important for that baby's immune system, because when babies come out, they don't have any exposure to germs in the environment, so they have to build that. We want to make sure that's a gradual build, that they're not exposed to too much. However, the mother still should be careful what she eats and drinks, because there is some crossing of fat-soluble chemicals through and into the breast milk. Okay. Any questions so far? Well, there's just a chart on the last page, so you can just maybe have a look at that on your own and have a quick read through it, and then we'll go to the worksheet.